Children and parents often tend to be on different planets as they communicate. You've seen that. Neither person is hearing the other, and that eliminates the possibility of feeling real connection. Let me illustrate. First, I'm going to illustrate with two adults. I was in the room as Heather said to her husband, Adam, I feel like we just don't do anything together. Adam said, but I do lots of stuff with you. And he began to name some of the activities that they'd shared in recent weeks. Adam turned to me and he said, see, this happens all the time. She just says stuff that isn't true and then I'm supposed to somehow fix it. The conversation went off the rail in the first 2 sentences. Wow, what happened? The answer is important because these arguments happen every day all over the world and almost certainly every day for you. There are many reasons that a conversation can go badly, but I illustrated one problem here by asking Adam, what is the subject of this conversation with Heather? What's the subject? He immediately started to defend himself. So I interrupted and I said, stop. Heather spoke first. So she determined the subject of the conversation. You weren't speaking. She spoke, so it's her subject. What did she say? Adam was still defending himself in his head. So I had to think for a little bit before he said, well, she said, we don't do anything together. I repeated, so what is the subject of the conversation? He said, that I didn't do stuff with her. I said, no, that's not the subject of the conversation at all. You missed it, and that's why the conversation went straight into the toilet. You could hear the toilet flushing before the two of you got warmed up. He said, well, then I'm lost. I said, yeah, you got that right. You are lost. She was talking about how she felt alone. That was the subject. She did mention not doing things together, yeah, but that was her attempt to explain why she felt alone. I know it wasn't perfectly clear, but that was the subject. What she meant to say was this, quote, Adam, I'm not feeling as close to you as I'd like, and I want to feel more important and connected to you. I want to feel more loved, end quote. Adam looked like I'd hit him. He said, really? That's what she was trying to say? And I said, well, in case you missed it, right now, Heather is vigorously nodding her head next to you, going, that's it. That's what she meant to say. And even though she didn't state it very clearly, that was still the subject of the conversation. And he said, wow, I would have never seen that. I said, and then you answered with how you've been doing things with her instead of answering her need to feel more loved. You didn't mean to, but you changed the subject from her not feeling loved to how you have been doing things with her. See? 2 different subjects. They sound related, but they're not really. You were doomed in 2 sentences. So, how should I have responded? He asked. I said, that's actually sweet of you to ask. So I went over to Heather, sat down next to her, held both her hands, looked her straight in the eyes, which is apparently something he didn't do very often. And after explaining that I was playing the role of Adam and speaking for him, I said, and responding to what she'd said, we never do anything together, and answering his question, how should I have responded? I said this, being Adam. Heather, I've been neglecting you and not telling you how much I love you, not with my words or with my behavior. What would you like most from me right now? Heather cried. Why? Because she felt like he heard what she was saying and proved his interest in her. And that was with me playing his role. She felt that touched. She could feel it from him because he was nodding his head. He wasn't disagreeing. We change the subject with other people a lot. And I've listened to thousands of conversations, and it sounds like two people delivering separate monologues side by side, as though the other person isn't there. Nobody's listening or addressing what matters. How does this happen between parent and child? Because we're here to talk about parenting. First example, Dad enters the room where his 14-year-old son, Wiley, has been playing a video game for about 30 minutes from the moment that he got home from school. Dad says, "What are you doing?" Wiley makes no response. He's completely immersed in his game. Dad turns off the game. Clearly irritated, Wiley says, "What are you doing?" Dad says, "What is the rule?" Notice, he doesn't tell Wiley why he turned the game off or what he's doing. He asks, so that Wiley has to say the words and take responsibility for them. We lecture our children too much. We need to ask them questions. Still irritated, Wiley says, "I'm just playing for a few minutes to relax after school." Now, at this point, the conversation just breaks down completely, with Dad saying it was more than a few minutes and Wiley arguing that it's not, and him saying that Dad had made him miss reaching the next level when Dad turned off the game, and blah, blah, blah. And you do this all the time, and they're in the toilet in seconds. We need to identify the original subject of the conversation and not change it. No matter who started the conversation, that's the subject. The family rule is that in their family, and in our family too, we work before we play. And Wiley had not completed his after-school chores, nor had he begun his homework. Dad screwed up by not stating the subject clearly. He said, "What are you doing?" Oh, that can go anywhere. It would have been clearer if Dad had said, "What is the family rule?" Now we're clearly stating the subject. 2, Wiley changed the subject by not responding. You could not speak and change the subject. He did hear Dad. He did. I learned this later, and Dad said, "Oh no, I don't think he heard," and he checked with his son, and he heard him. But he didn't want to address that subject, which is the family law, work before play, so he brought up a new subject, all quite unintentionally. He said, with his silence, "I don't want to talk about this." Really? 3, Dad restated the subject, again, not clearly, by turning off the game. Wiley changed the subject again to, "I was just relaxing." There's no way he was going to address his own lack of responsibility in breaking the rules. "And you don't care about me." See how badly this can go in seconds? So what could Dad have done differently? He could clearly have said, "What is the family rule?" And if Wiley didn't answer that question clearly, Dad needed to restate the question over and over until it was answered. Otherwise, the subject is never addressed. And then the next day, they get to go through it again. And this gets boring. And then people start to get irritated and further apart. And people wonder why they divorce, because they say, "Well, we just grew apart." No, you never communicated. You never talked. You never listened. You kept changing the subject. That's with divorce. But the same thing happens with kids. There's just not a legal document. They just quit speaking to you. Second example of changing the subject. Lisa, age 12, comes home from school, and she's wearing an obvious frown. Mom says, without really looking at Lisa's face closely, Mom says, "So, how was school?" How many parents have said that? If you're a parent and you haven't said that to a child after school, I'd be very surprised. Lisa muttered, "Fine." That's got to be the winner for the most common answer to that question. Mom persists. She said, "Did you learn anything interesting?" Lisa's irritation escalates, and she says, "No," and stomps off to her room. Conversation is over. Again, we have to ask, what was the original subject? This is tricky because the subject was stated without words. People are speaking all the time, whether they're using their lips or not. It's a common aphorism. With your children, the job is to teach, 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 and sometimes use words, because you're teaching with your example. So Lisa walked into the room, we're going to go back to the beginning from school, with a frown on her face. That frown was saying something, and that's the subject. She was saying, I'm very unhappy. Now we got the subject. And Mom changed the subject to what? What she had learned at school. That didn't interest Lisa one bit. Lisa felt ignored, which was true, actually, and stomped off to her room. Lisa didn't state the subject in words. In fact, she did with a frown, because on so many occasions, Mom had failed to listen to her speak in words and changed the subject to something that interested Mom. So she just gave up trying to talk to Mom at all. After somebody changes the subject on you 100 times, you just quit talking to them. How could this have gone better? I can tell you this from many similar experiences that I've had with parents and children. And I shared this with Mom when she called me to tell me about this. So the next time Lisa came home from school with a frown, which happened to be the next day, Mom stopped what she was doing. Doesn't matter. Whatever's on the stove, take it off the stove. She walked over to Lisa and she held her hand out like this, palm up. Lisa knew what that meant, as most of us do. So she put her hand in her mother's hand. Mom led Lisa over to the couch, sat with her and said, "You look really unhappy. Would you be willing to tell me about it?" Mom is staying on subject. Lisa, understandably a little doubtful about this new behavior from Mom, said, "It's nothing." A kid with the frown on their face, it's never nothing. Mom had decided to stay with the initial subject. I'm unhappy. That's what Lisa was saying. So she continued to hold Lisa's hand and look into her face. And with her other hand, so she's holding her hand here, she lifted Lisa's chin up, because Lisa was looking at the floor, until their eyes met, and Mom said, "You really look unhappy. I love you, and I'm here to listen for as long as it takes." To Mom's shock, because this had been going on for many months, Lisa jumped up into Mom's lap, wrapped her arms around her, and bawled. Poured out her heart about how she didn't fit in at school, she didn't feel as worthwhile as other people, and on and on. And it was the beginning of many such conversations, because Mom didn't change the subject. We human beings instinctively avoid pain. So when a painful subject arises, we do whatever it takes to avoid it. Your children will do that. You as a parent will do that. But you're the parent, and it's your responsibility and opportunity to love and teach them. You can't accomplish this if you allow your child to change the subject you've chosen to teach, or if you change that subject when your child starts a conversation. Got to stay with the subject and complete it till people really feel listened to. And you can learn more about changing the subject in conversations as it happens between two adults in blogs that you'll find on the reallove.com site, dated October 1, 2014 and February 23, 2018.